Hey everyone, welcome to the Swift Arcade. I'm your host, Jonathan Rasmussen. So excited for this week's episode. Today we're going to get into what I think is one of the most confusing things for new iOS developers, core animation. What is it? How does it relate to UIKit? How do I get things to move around? If you've been puzzled, stymied, and you don't understand how this framework works, come on in and today we're going to figure it out together. All right, so what is this thing called core animation? Core animation is the library that sits underneath UIKit, Swift UI, and is pretty much responsible for every animation you see that happens on your iPhone. It sits right here under UIKit and AppKit, just above core graphics. And whenever you come across CA, whether it's layer, gradient, shape, or animation, that means you're touching the core animation library. Now, just to be clear, we don't always need to be working in core animation. UIKit has a whole host of higher level animation APIs, property-based animators, view controller transition, physics-based animations. Normally, we want to be using these when working up there in UIKit. So why study core animation at all? Well, I think there's two really good reasons to study core animation. One is sometimes the animation you want to do using these higher level APIs just can't be done. I need to drop down into that lower level core animation level to get the effect you want. But secondly, and almost more importantly, I think it's really good understanding. I really struggled with animation when I first got into iOS. I didn't understand exactly how things worked, what was happening, and whenever I Googled and found examples that dropped down to that CA layer, I was completely lost. And that's kind of the point of this tutorial. I want to introduce you to core animation from a first principles point of view. Let's just see how things actually work. And I hope that's going to give you the insight then to understand what's going on at these higher levels, as well as drop down occasionally if you do need to do some really cool things. Okay, so how does it work? Core animation basically works off something called the CA layer. Every view has an underlying CA layer, and if you've ever wanted to round a corner, add some shadows, you've probably already worked with it before. But it's in this layer where all the cool stuff happens, and this is where we actually add our animations to our views. For example, if we wanted to move a rectangle from left and right, we would create a basic animation, specify what we want to animate via its key path, and then define its before and after position, and finally animate. We can also scale things up. Here we can specify a different key path, in this case something called transform scale. And we can say that we like to scale from an initial size of 1, double the size of 2 over a duration of 0.4 seconds, and we can scale it up. We can also rotate things. Here we're working with another key path, transform rotation Z. This is the Z axis coming out of the view. Here we're working with radians. If you remember your math from high school or university, this is the amount of angle that we're rotating, but basically we're just adding these animations to our layer and then moving things along. Of course, once you get really good at this, you can start to do some really cool things. For example, if we wanted to shake a login box when someone entered an incorrect username or password, we could do that using keyframe animations. Here we're basically saying, here's our position X, and we like it to shake it back and forth by specifying these values at these key times. And core animation will take care of the rest. It'll interpolate between them, give it the shake, and make it work. So at a high level, that's kind of how core animation works. That's how we specify some basic animations. Let's now jump into the lab and see what these things look like in action. All right, so let's fire up Xcode. Let's create a brand new app here. Let's call this Animation Fun. Go ahead and accept all the defaults there. Feel free to save it wherever you like. I'm just going to save this to my desktop. And we are going to do all of our work in this view controller here. So let's just hang out here and make a little bit of space. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is basically we're going to do a simple move. I'm going to show you how to take a red rectangle like this and animate it over here. Looks really simple, but there's actually quite a bit of things going on here that are good to understand. So let's start by just defining this red rectangle. And we are going to do that by basically specifying a plain UI view. We are going to explicitly set it's CGRect, basically saying we're going to say, hey, I'd like you to appear about here with an X value of 20, a Y value of 100, and a width and a height. We're going to explicitly set that rect. Then the other thing we're going to do is basically just give this some properties. Let's go ahead and give our red view a nice background. So our red view wouldn't be red if we didn't set its background color here to be system red. And just one thing to note, even though we're working up here with the UI view, a lot of these things we set, like these background colors and that, they're often just passed right through to the CA layer behind the scenes, which is what we're going to see. We're then going to add this view to our subview. So let's go view.add subview, our red view here. And that should be enough to basically get it on the screen. Let's try the mini, the 12 mini. Let's run it on there. Okay, there we go. So we've got our rectangle up there positioned at X of 20, Y of 20 with a width and a height. Let's now animate this. And I'm just going to copy in this function called animation, and we will talk about and see how this thing actually works. But let's just animate it as soon as the view comes up here. So I'm just going to call animate. I'm going to run this again, and let's see if we can actually get that red square to go left to right. There we go. Okay, perfect. So what is actually going on here? Well, this is your basic CA animation. It's probably the most basic animation we can do. We're defining an animation. We're setting its key path, which is basically the property we want to animate. And now this is the stuff that's kind of confusing that you really need to understand. This from and this to value. How do we calculate these values of 20 with 140 divided by 2 to 2 value of 300? Well, this is where you really need to understand the core animation and core graphics coordinate system. What's going on here is we're really animating the shape's position. And this is probably one of the most confusing things when you get into core animation. What are we actually animating? It's always this middle position, or sometimes referred to as the anchor position. That's what we're animating. So remembering that the coordinate system increases as we go down and to the right, and understanding that our rectangle has an X, Y value of 20 and 20, to calculate this position, or what we want to animate, we need to take basically half of the width to figure out what that point is. So in this case, 90. So if we go back to Xcode now and say we want to animate this over to a final value of 300, that's what we're specifying here with this from value and this to value. So sometimes it helps to draw these things out. We're going to give a duration of 1 second, and then we add that animation to our layer, and I'm going to comment this out for a second, and off we go. But watch what happens when we do this and I comment out this final line. Did you see what happened there? Our animation reset. Let's watch that one more time. It's going to slide over, and then it's going to reset. This is the two model thing I was talking about. Core animation has two models that it uses to track the different layers and how the animation is going. The model layer tracks all of the actual physical attributes of where the view actually lives right now. That's how we can round corners, set its initial position. That's called the model. But when it's animating, it's got this different presentation model which keeps track of the views as they slide over. And when it gets into this final position, we need to update our original model with what the original animated position looks like. That's why we need this line here. What we're basically saying is when this animation completes, we need to update the view's final position to where it ends up, which is at this 300. In other words, this position right here. So as we slide it over, we need to update the final position with an X value of 300. That's why if you ever see your core animations do the animation and then reset, it's because you're not setting its final value here, which is why this line is really important. And that's basically how Move works. All right, next let's take a look at scaling. How do you actually scale in core animation? And to do this, I'm also going to show you how to use core animation in conjunction with UIKit when you need to know the size of your views. I'll show you what I mean. Here in this example, we explicitly define the position and size of our rectangle using CGRect. That's really good for demonstrating core animation, but it's not necessarily what we want to do when working with UIKit. So what we're going to do instead here is I'm just going to define this as a plain UI view. And then I'm also going to define some attributes or properties that I like our view I would like our view to eventually be. In this case, that width and height of 140 by 100. Now let's go in here. Let's still make our red view background look like this. We're still going to add it, but instead of animating in here and doing a work, we're going to do one more little thing. We are going to size this view once we know what the screen size of our iPhone is. In other words, we're going to make it dynamic. And we're going to do that by overriding view did appear. So we're going to come in here, override view did appear. And once we get into here, we know what the size of our device is. It's rendered, it's laid itself out. So we can use that now to relatively size our view. What I mean by that is instead of hard coding the size of this view, we can use the properties of our view, specifically its bounds, to get the mid X, the center point of our view, the mid Y, so basically where the middle of our phone is, and then we can take half the width, half the height, and draw an explicit rect here based on the size of the view. So I just wanted you to see this mechanic. Basically, if you don't want to just hard code things all the time and you want them to be dynamic, this is how you can do it. So if we run this now, let's just see if we get a nice red shape. There we go, a nice red rectangle showing up sized relatively to our phone size. So this will work on any simulator now. Now let's take a look at how to do the animation. Scaling an animation looks something like this. We're going to do the same basic animation. How we control the animation is we're going to change our key path. Here is transform scale. We want to scale out. Oh, and by the way, if you're curious, you can look up all the different scale properties I've added a link to the bottom of the notes here. You can go look up in the documentation all the different things you can scale. So you can rotate, you can scale, you can translate. These are all the different key path settings that let you control the type of animation you'd like to do. Just be aware a little bit in the documentation. It can be a bit confusing. Don't just take rotation Z or basically scale here and think that you can just add scale and translate it. You need to add this transform string in front of it. That's why you need to go transform scale, not just scale. So if you're a little bit confused with the documentation, just be aware of that. But that's basically how we can set these things. So once we've got that in there, let's see if we can just go ahead and animate this now. I'm just going to call our animate method after our view did appear. And let's see if we can get that nice red rectangle to scale up. And there you go. That's how you scale. You might be wondering, how do we rotate a view? Well, it's the exact same thing. We just come in here. Instead of doing this kind of animation, we specify a rotate. In this case, just note we're going to rotate about the Z axes. That's the one coming out of the page. So we have X, Y, Z comes out of the page. So we're going to, if we want our shape to rotate, it's about that Z axis. And we're just going to specify, in this case, the unit of measure is radians, not angles. So we're going to go from a radian of 0 to 45 degrees, which is pi divided by 4, and a duration of 1 second. And if we run this now, also remember we need to reset our final position, which we're doing with the CA transform. You can see how we can just rotate things very simply by, in this case, 45 degrees. Okay, that's all pretty cool, but what if we want to do something really neat like shake? What if we want to take a view and shake it back and forth? How do we do that? Well, we can do that using these things called keyframes. And the way keyframes work is you basically define all the different positions you would like your view to oscillate between, almost like animations in a movie if you're animating something. So in this case, what we would like to animate is the X position. In other words, we'd like our red view here, a red rectangle, to shake back and forth. So we're going to do that along position X. And then these are the values of our keyframes. We're going to say I'd like that position X to go from 0 to plus 10 to minus 10 to plus 10 back to 0. So we're going to add it, subtract it, add it, subtract it. That's what's going to move this thing back and forth. Those are the values. And then our key times are here. In seconds, we're specifying at the 0 second, we'd like it to be here. At 0.16, we like it to be here. Half a second here, 8.3. And that's what's going to make it shake back and forth at these relative times with the duration of 0.4 seconds. So if we add this now to our red view here, you can see how it shook back and forth. We're just taking the shape, reflecting it back and forth. And that's how we can add some really nice, cool shake effects to some of our views. And do check out the source code. I show you how to do this also to a text field in here, which is exactly the same thing. We would just change red view to text field, and it would work for whatever view we put in there. Okay, so we've already done some really cool things. Moving, rotating, shaking. What about this one? What if we want to take that square and make it rotate around that circle? How do we do that? When doing animations like this, I find it handy to draw out the shapes I want to animate on the screen and then do my animation relative to them here. So even though I may not want this red circle to appear, it'd be nice to draw this out to see what this actually looks like. So why don't we see if we can draw, first of all, the red square, the circle, and then we'll do the animation. So let's come back over here to our red view, and let's just say that instead of making this a rectangle, we'd like it to make it a square of size 40/40. Then we're going to define, in this case, I'm going to make something called an image view, and we're going to draw our circle in there with a diameter of 300. Then just coming down here, we need to remember to add to our subview our red circle. So we'll get that in our view hierarchy. And then let's come down here to view did appear, and let's just comment out the animation for a second. First of all, let's just get our red box on the screen there. So what we're going to do is just what we did before. We're going to draw our box out here in the size of a square. Now note in this case, I'm not doing the width and height, and I'll explain why in a second. I just want you to see that the midpoint of the screen is this corner right here. That's where we're going to put our red square. And for our circle, we're going to draw this, doing good old core graphics work here. We're going to define the frame for our circle here. It's going to be a CG rect. In this case, I am going to take into account the diameter of the circle because I do want it to appear in the middle. And then we're going to use our UI graphics renderer, which is a way in core graphics of actually enabling us to draw into an image, which we can set onto our image view. And this is how we draw a circle in core graphics. We take our image renderer, we say we're getting an image. This is a callback in here where we can then define our rectangle, do some core graphics work, set stroke, fill line. In this case, we're going to add an ellipse and then draw that path onto our context. And if we do that, we should get a circle showing up. Okay, now perfect. Now look at this. When I naively got into core animation and I wanted to make this square, animate around here, I do some Googling, I'd find the animation code and I add it, just like this. I'd go down to my animation code and I'd say, okay, let's animate something around a circle like this. So what are we actually doing? Well, this is where I find core animation can really be confusing. So let's slowly just walk through the coordinate system, what's going on here. So when we animate, everything we animate is relative to the view that we're adding the animation to. So in this case, our red square, which sits right here, we want to circle, we want to animate around it relative to this point right here, or its position here. So how do we do that? Well, in this case, to draw the circle, we actually want to come up here, half the diameter of the circle, to an x and a y of diameter divided by 2 and a y of diameter divided by 2. That's taking it up here, moving it in the negative xy direction, and defining a point somewhere out here. This is our bounding rectangle. This is just a rectangle, which is going to define our animation, and then we're giving it a width of the diameter, 300, and a height also of 300. So you can think of a rectangle going out around here. Now here's the animation. We're doing our keyframe animation. We're going to change the position, which is the X and the Y. And in this case, we're saying we'd like the position to change in the shape of an ellipse. using our bounded rectangle. So now we've got a path going around here, around that bounded rectangle in the shape of an ellipse. And then we're basically just adding other animation properties. It's going to take 2 seconds. It's going to be additive, which means it's just going to keep going as you add it around. There's these different modes. There's a calculation mode and rotation mode, which is paste and auto rotate. I don't need these semicolons here. But basically this just defines the animation moving around here. And then we finally add that to our red layer and things should work. But watch what happens when we run this. Because that circle is defined relatively, oh, I got to call animate. Because we define the circle animation relative to that square and they're not perfectly centered, look how the square moves. It's moving not in a perfect circle, it's kind of moving just off. It's like the square isn't perfectly aligned with your circle. And this just bugged me to no end when I was first trying to figure out core animation. What's going on here? Well, what can really make your life simpler when working with core animation is the understanding that everything is relative. We want this circle to in fact be centered relative to the square. And if we do that, things will work out a lot better. So instead of drawing our square out here, just naively with an X and a Y and a height and a width like this, let's take into account that we want this square to actually be centered and center it in the position of our screen like this. Let's offset it and take the width into account, the height into account. If we do this now and see what this looks like, this will put the rectangle right in the center and will animate it perfectly along those lines. Another way of looking at it is like this. You can see here how basically we were just off because we didn't have it perfectly centered. When we center it perfectly here, we get that circle right in the middle, and then it's able to move perfectly along the path of our ellipse. So you can just make your lives easier by taking whatever shape you're animating, centering it relative to the path you want, and that will just make your life a lot easier. Now, to make your lives easier when playing with these things, I've created a full-on demo, which if you go into the Swift Arcade, if you want the full text walkthrough of what we've just done here, go into the core animation intro and you'll see everything we talked about here. The source code you can actually find just by clicking on intro here and going into demo. And in there you will see a nice demo I've created, just letting you play with these things. I've added an animate button at the bottom so you can click and do these types of things. And I just really encourage you to play with these things in really small baby steps. It's the only way I was able to really understand what was going on. Drawing things out, drawing pictures like these obviously really helped. And that's just a really good way to solidify everything that's happening. Okay, well, there you have it, folks. A quick introduction to core animation. I was really excited to create this episode because this was something that really intimidated me for a long time. As I got into animation and I found so many different examples of what was going on, UIKit, core animation, I didn't understand the mechanics of what was going on, and just working through these I found really helped. So now I feel a lot more confident when I go into using UIKit animations. I'm not going to be intimidated by Swift UI. It's all using core animation behind the scenes, and once you understand the mechanics of how these things work, hopefully it'll give you that insight. It won't make those code bases anywhere near as intimidating as they need to be, and you really understand at a basic level how animation in iOS works. And if nothing else, you know how to rotate, shake, and move some objects. Well, anyways, I hope you found that useful. If you like this video, do click like, do click subscribe. I enjoy making these, and do come back and we'll continue our journey learning iOS things together. Okay, take care everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.